The question I was going to ask Holly at the end of her talk, as her talk ended, was basically, struggle is all there is. What on earth else could there possibly be? And then we heard Leon's paper, which essentially gives us an answer, which is destituents. I mean, so I guess I wanted to ask you both in a way to sort of comment on that conjunction of your two papers. Is destituents, does it, Holly, to what extent does it or does it not give you that sort of opening that, in a sense, your paper, when you ask the question near the end of your paper, maybe it doesn't matter all that much what our conception of time and history is. In a sense, when you ask that question, when you say that, maybe it doesn't matter all that much. Maybe what you're doing there is opening up to something like what Leon is theorizing as destituents, meaning a kind of evacuation of the very terms of political struggle, of the very constituency of political struggle. And then I also wanted to ask you, Leon, a question which is coming at a different side of things, really. But for example, when we read in, and I'm also very interested in the Invisible Committee's text. One of the very famous moments in that text that I've been intrigued by is when they talk about the riot, and they say, in the riot there is a production and affirmation of friendships, a focused configuration of the world, clear possibilities of action. There's something like a gesture towards immanence, the immanence of the struggle, and in a way the means becoming the ends, or the ends becoming the means. And I'm wondering whether Trumpianism, I mean, it's a horrible question in a way, but is Trumpianism, is the emergent right that we're faced with at the moment something like a destituent, an incipient destituency?
Maybe I could just quickly jump in for that last question. Somebody, I was trying to talk up this argument, and somebody was like, "Well, how is that not just like what the right is doing?" And I was like, "Oh, right, that's a really good question." I mean, I think that there's that moment where they say that, right, the characteristic gesture of constituent power is, what is it, is like rushing, what is it? I can't remember the quote even. It's like laying siege to or something. And the characteristic gesture of destituency is exiting. So, I mean, yeah, I mean, I think that there is, right, there's something kind of terrifying about the idea of like evacuating the apparatus, the institutions of the state that are, after all, protecting a lot of people in some ways. And, I think that there is this kind of question about, is there anything inherently sort of left oriented about destituency? I guess I'm interested in the kind of like occupy bedroom move a little bit more because of the, I don't know, I guess to me that seems to be a little bit more, I mean, it does like scramble the kind of conventional distinctions between left and right, I guess, maybe. Other people have sort of asked me about shy radicals if there's like a kind of incel culture kind of thing going on, which I actually think that there is, interestingly. But I mean, I think these are like important, what the collectivos sesiones people call like crisis subjectivities that are emerging, right? Like the incel, or the kind of the occupied bedroom figure, that do scramble, because they take place in these weird kind of quasi-public, quasi-private spaces of online chat boards and things. The kind of conventional like left-right grid that I think actually Lynn's talk yesterday was also getting us to kind of think through. So yeah, I don't know. I mean, I think there could be, I guess, like a right-wing destituency. I don't think there's anything inherently leftist about it, but I do think that there are traditions of kind of utopian and alternative projects that are interesting to think about as sort of, genealogies or traditions that could counter those kind of fascistic or rightward tendencies, maybe. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Leon. Okay, there are a lot of questions actually, so let's keep our questions pointed and direct as much as possible, and our answers. Sharon.
Thanks so much for these fabulous papers. So I wanted to follow up basically on one aspect of Tim's question, because it was a question I had too for you, Holly. At the very end, you said, well, does it matter? Or maybe it doesn't matter. Or maybe the question of, how we understand the trajectory of history and time. Or maybe you said at the very end, maybe it does matter now, but in a way that's different from how it mattered in the past. And so I wanted to just ask you to reflect on that, say more about what you have in mind about that, because I found that really interesting. And then for Leon, and maybe this is also for Holly, about destituents. Would you think of Larry Kramer and ACT UP as an example of destituents, or not? I mean, I think about like how serious is the connection, or how deep or necessary between destituents and exiting, because I'm really glad that Larry Kramer didn't exit, I'm glad he fought. I'm glad he stood and fought and made a movement, ACT UP, that actually had an impact on how gay men with AIDS were treated medically, and on research funding for AIDS, and ultimately on gay liberation more generally, liberation for gay, queer people more generally. So, and I can't really tell if that's destituents or if that's old-fashioned social activism, So anyway, then I know we're supposed to be quick, but I had one last thought, because I was thinking so much about Avishek's talk about repair, and about a thought I had in connection with things he was saying about repair as being a kind of, not a fix, but a sort of continuing process of mending, which maybe sort of fits with the idea of there's nothing but struggle. But then Avishek made the, I think, very interesting point that if we think about it, repair only as mending, there's a risk of kind of recapitulating the status quo. And so another important piece of repair is design, which I interpret in this context as having something to do with aspiration, with some kind of aspiration for, to carry out the mending in a way that takes us somewhere different than the status quo, and not just different, but also better, even though it doesn't sort of promise in a dangerous way some utopian final end point, or necessarily express itself through the formation of some new set of potentially stultifying institutional forms or whatever. I'll stop there.
Thank you so much for this amazing panel. My question probably a little bit long. I really love the conversation between the two, by the way, because I was also thinking from Holly's paper, is invisible struggle still struggle, right? Is a lot of thinking about, is the struggle have something to be detectable, visible? But my question is addressing to Leo, particularly, I want to thinking about whether the destituents, I'm sorry, my pronunciation is wrong, but it's the term, the concept.
It's a hard word, yeah.
Well, one related with what Lynn said yesterday about the color-wise unthinking. I want to think about whether or not, from a historical point of view, from the earlier prototype, talk about the 1970s kind of radical kind of invisibility to today's, whether or not that was part of, or at least can be related with the wider is sort of tendency of unthinking that Lynn talked about yesterday, which is, I think she talked about not necessarily pathological, but at least some kind of signature that is mediated. The reason I mentioned the importance of media is, first, I want to ask you, when they are invisible, Is it invisible only in the public space or invisible everywhere? How about a visibility on media, such as internet, or any kind of mediation? I asked that question because hikikomori you mentioned at the end is a specific, very good example. They are only invisible in the public space. They are visible very much on the digital space. At least that's why a lot of scholars will say it's actually a mistake to think about hikikomori entirely hidden. They're not hidden at all. They're very, very visible on the media. Actually, the very reason they can afford being invisible in the public space because the digital media afford them the connectivity. So I want to emphasize invisibility is not isolation. In fact, hikikomori is a very connected community on the media. And there are a lot of despite the public media tend to pathologizing the hikikomori, there's another kind of tendency try to advocating them a new kind of human being, particularly Japanese type, even with nationalist tendency to say this is a new kind of human subjectivity, even if not subjectivity, a lot of theorization. And I think one of the theorization by several Japanese thinkers, including both Azuma Hikari and Akira Azada, is the sense of they borrow from the early 20th century Japanese philosophy to say there's something actually shielding them. That is the reason they can be destitute, they're like shining away, shy from the public institute because there's something invisible thing hiding them, like an invisible shield. So I'm here interested to talk about the wall. They said they are now running against the wall, but yet they're shielding themselves within another wall. That wall is what I said yesterday as the screen. That screen literally, right, the digital screen, the media. And that actually is a lot of the hikikomori argue that, yes, they can be hiding behind so-called anonymous on the screen. That's why hikikomori, when they're on the internet, they're always on certain platform that afford anonymous. For example, 4chan in Japan, 2chan in the US. So I want the first question is, what do you think about media's effect on it and how that for? Second is, what do you think about, again, the right-wing tendency? They are already right-wing. If you think about hikikomori as part of a movement, hikikomori right now in Japan has a strong tendency moving toward the right-wing, at least on the internet. On 4chan, there's a strong tendency moving right-wing. On 2chan in the US, you may say they are also kind of hikikomori in the United States, and they're also very right-wing, given the fact that they are part of active participation in the alt-right and the Q movement. So again, that's another question. But I'm asking is, can we also have a possibility of a radical left, but not only invisible from the public space, but also invisible from media? Can that be a sort of possibility to moving toward real radical left movement rather than the right wing? Because I think a lot of media theory to say why those hikikomori, even when they're invisible from public space, eventually going right wing, because media structures certainly afford, as what Lynn said yesterday, giving this kind of way of thinking that seeming to be leaning toward right wing, but of course not necessarily, but there is a tendency. So whether rather or not, we can have a certain kind of a destituents, but now through the televised or digital media and thinking, they provide a totally third way of invisibility that also can say no to media as institution. Sorry, very long question, sorry about that.
In some ways, this does build on especially what Sharon was asking about earlier. It seems to me, I also thought about Avishek's talk when I was listening to the two of you, and I also thought about Thomas Shestak's presentation. There seems to be a common interest here in finding ways to describe what I would call a kind of negative action or negative political action. But so in Avishek's case, of course, the idea of a repair that's not just about restoring the functions of an original, Sharon put it very well already. And in the case of Thomas Shestak, in his reply to Tim's question, for example, this care about how the analysis of term does not simply end up substituting a new minimal unit of meaning for it, right? So it's a taking apart that doesn't reinstitute some other ground. But it seems like in all four talks, the other thing that we need to sort of skirt around, or we need some delicacy around, is that our language of description should not re-operationalize negative action. So it seems as if we're also looking for a negative political language, or a language and a politics that would both kind of work in tandem rather than one in some ways restoring some sense of agency or efficacy to the other. But specifically, I wanted to say in both Holly's case and Leon's case, there was a text by Walter Benjamin that seemed to be sort of hovering in the background.
Yeah.
I was glad to see the Hikokomori text that you showed us at the very end, Leon, actually bring up the idea of a strike, right? But the other word that they used that I thought was really interesting in Benjaminian, in a sort of Benjaminian way, was they call themselves an intervention.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about that, like that sort of deferral repetition of that term of inter, right? Like the in between, that reminds me of what Benjamin has to say about a politics of pure means. This is like the pure middle that we're talking about, that will not be converted into product or into functionalization, but a kind of sort of incessant dwelling in the middle. For Holly, I would say it's so hard thinking in the German context of a way to talk about struggle that would not be contaminated by a fascist vocabulary, right? Kampf, Streben, Arbeit. I can't think of any term for struggle that wouldn't be contaminated that way. And maybe it's, I mean, struggle in the American context seems to have a kind of efficacy to it, but work and labor are so close to that, and they are so easily absorbed into other directions. Anyway, that's just my thought.
That's great. Yes, maybe just a couple of quick things. Like, yes, definitely any genealogy of destituents that would have to go to the critique of violence, absolutely. And I tried to spend some time with it, and then I was like, I don't have time to go into this in 30 minutes, but absolutely. And I think that is very point well taken. And I think that, yeah, there's like this Benjaminian echo in Hamza's work as well, with that intervention, the passive intervention, which I think is a great phrase of his. I think, the thing I was going to say, maybe in response to a couple, Jinying's question as well, was, you know, one of the things that, so Hamza-san is, he's a really fascinating figure for all kinds of reasons, but a big influence on him was the kind of zine culture of the UK of the 1990s. So he was really influenced by, there was like, a really kind of important and influential kind of zine community of particularly kind of like immigrant kids in the UK, and in particular a lot of kind of zine culture that came up around like mental health issues. And so he has this amazing collection of zines from the 90s about, you know, various forms of kind of mental health experiences and or experiences with the mental health system in the UK. And I think the form that Shy Radicals takes is very zine-like. And I like the zine as a kind of, like genre or kind of aesthetic form, or maybe media kind of to think about, because it's not, like the zine isn't aspiring to become a kind of, you know, a publishing house or whatever it is, right? It's all about this kind of DIY aesthetic of, you know, copying the things on your work copy machine, right? And, you know, sort of circulating it in these kind of underground, you know, networks of, you know, trading zines online or at the Tower Records or whatever. So I think that there's something interesting about thinking about the zine as a kind of destituent form, maybe, that like that destitutes the journal or the book or something like this. And I think maybe Invisible Committee works in a similar way. So that's maybe something to think about in terms of media. And then the question about like if ACT UP is the destituent movement, I think is like totally fascinating. I mean, I think in some ways it is, in some ways it's not. I mean, of course, Lyra Kramer did found the Gay Men's Health Crisis, which is an institution, right, that continues to exist. ACT UP was it was, you know, very organized, but there was a certain mode of spontaneity that I think was important to its, you know, kind of at least performative, dimensions. And, you know, I think, I guess one of the reasons that I started with the Argentina example is that I just think that slogan of everyone, all of them must go, like, what does it mean to like organize behind that as a political slogan? And I think that I don't know, I just think that that's really provocative and interesting to think about. And maybe the negative action thing, it's like, we're demanding that everyone, we don't know what's going to happen after, but everyone just needs to go, right? And so I think that that's kind of an interesting place to start as a way of thinking about what destituents is and what its demands are. It's like, yeah, so those are just some quick thoughts.
Great, thank you, Leon. Holly, unless you want to say something, maybe we'll take a couple more questions. So maybe Yannis, Avishek, and Peter.
Yeah, thank you, and thank you for the great papers, both of you, Leon and Holly. So just a few thoughts, quick thoughts on both papers. For Holly's paper, I took two related but not identical points. The one is to do with the trajectory of history. And to me, that seemed to be a discussion about teleology. And I think that's distinct, if that's the case, distinct from the second question, which is about the struggle or the notion of the struggle. I feel that if we are to reject the teleological nature of the pronouncements about the trajectory of history, then, which I think most of us probably would here, then the notion of the struggle becomes a matter of definition, and whether we actually talk about struggle as in conscious political action, or whether we're talking about something more specific, the specific pronouncements of political parties or organizations or revolutionary subjects in the 20th century. Because I thought that just to connect it with the second paper, the group of social actors we'd examined under destituents, it was very diverse. So the Invisible Committee, for example, which I follow quite closely, I think is very different from the movement Occupy the Bedroom or the other social actors we talked about. It seems to me that Invisible Committee is closer to many of the other more conventional political actors. Let's recall their first pamphlet, which was The Coming Insurrection. And even on this pamphlet, the Now pamphlet, I think it's actually, there is an articulation of a political discourse that connects with many of the political movements of the late 20th century. And in terms of their theoreticians, they reference Deleuze, they reference Rancière in terms of the distribution of affect, they reference the notion of individuation of forms as opposed to individuation of bodies. So reworking of Simonton in a different direction. And so I would say that they are not really the same. They don't seem to proclaim the same definition of action compared to other groups that we examine, or you examined, Leo, in terms of complete withdrawal from what we call society. So I love the term, and I think it's very, very efficacious and very interesting to think with, but I think it's too polysemous perhaps, and includes many different movements in the broader sense, and many different actions that may need to be disentangled and considered separately. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Yannis. Avishek?
Yes, thank you, Tim, and thank you so much, both of you, for your papers, Leon and Holly, and thank you also, Sharon, for your comment, and Zachary for referring to my presentation. I'll try to come to them and also hopefully ask my question quickly. I was beginning to think, by the end of 2 days, that in listening to at least more than one presentation, that what I felt, I was doing with this kind of tentative theorizing, the kind of cautious theorizing, tentative concepts, the neither this and the nor that, particularly the neither progressive, the neither conservative character of, in my case, repair, but also some of the other ways you were talking about, destituents or struggle. So what I was thinking, I'm genuinely kind of wondering aloud, thinking aloud with trying to think and, learning from all our presentations, is that are we really at a point where, the concepts, our political commitments and our political affiliations are where they are, we know. But when it comes to the concepts and the method that we are working with, should we be a little wary of really settled, kind of notions of, well, this will go this way and that will go this way, because of the way we are tracing the histories of these concepts. I'm wondering if we are, to do, I think it's again, Sedgwick who had coined this, this kind of weak theory, because the convictions of strong theory have proven us wrong so many times in recent times, in the last few decades, that I'm kind of wondering aloud if there is some value to that, that kind of a gesture. Sharon, what you said about design, I'm so glad you brought the design thing up, because that is precisely the context in which I'm trying to kind of make some gestures in room, that the difference between repair as fixing and repair as design, so the and it's not very widely argued yet in the design field, but the idea that some people are beginning to say that what if we really destabilize the distinction between repair as design and designing for repair, right? And this also relates to the Fred Moten quote that I had I think also read out, where he says, what if we could detach repair not only from restoration but also from the very idea of the original, not so that repair comes first but that it comes before. In that case, making and repair are inseparable, devoted to one another, suspended between and beside themselves. So I mean, that's what I'm trying to think through. So I really appreciate your comments on that gesture. And I didn't come to get to talk about Arturo Escobar's recent work on this, which is where he's kind of trying to push this, what he calls the cultural studies of design, right? So that's that's kind of in appreciation of the comments. My kind of question for Leon was that again, on the lines of something that Sharon asked. Do you think, I mean, I was thinking of, again, Moten and Harney's notion of the undercommons and fugitivity when I was thinking of destituents, and I was just wondering if you thought there was any resonance there or not. So thank you.
Do you want to answer that, Leon, about Harney and Moten?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that, well, one place that I didn't go, but that I was thinking I could go, was thinking about like prison abolitionist discourse, because there is that move about saying, it's not about just abolishing prisons, it's about abolishing a society that would need prisons, right? So I think that, to the extent that I see Harney and Moten as participating in a sort of larger conversation that I would, identify with a kind of abolitionist position. There's a kind of abolitionist university studies, right, is the thing now. So I think, there's that sort of moment of Destituents is about sort of reimagining or rethinking the entirety of, it's not just like going against the institution, but it's going against the entire society that would have an institution, that would need an institution like a prison, or I guess like a university, maybe. But thanks, that's great.
Peter.
Yes, I wanted to follow up in a way on Zach's comment about Benjamin's presence in the background of this discussion, and so I was thinking that when Agamben talks about destituency, destituent power, he explicitly refers to Benjamin's text, the Critique of Violence, and in a way, both in Benjamin's text and in Agamben's reference to it, there is something else maybe in the background, and it is anarchy. And so the question of anarchy, I think, is crucial here when we talk about destituency. And I just wanted to tell you, Leon, I don't know what you can make of that, and I'm sure you know this much better than I do. I vaguely remember that Deligny comes from an anarchist family on his mother's side, and that anarchy, in a way, is something that he discusses, debates, but more seriously, I mean, I guess the question that destituency as a political concept raises is the relationship between anarchy and time, anarchy and duration, right? So how can we think together anarchy and duration? That's, I think, the main question it raises.
Shall we hear from Adi, and then we'll hear from Holly and Leon, sort of any other things that they want to say and how they want to address these. Adi.
Thank you. Fascinating two papers, but I feel I have to be a little pedestrian and ask a few pedestrian questions. Struggle. What kind of struggle? We heard about the association of struggle in German, but this is not only idea of struggle. I think that Leon gave us a very clear example of a different struggle. All the examples that he cited are forms of struggle. Are they political or not? I don't think we know. I don't think we can judge in advance. Each kind of struggle redraws the line of the political, or the redefine the political. Is struggle all there is? With quotes? Obviously not. I mean, he wrote books. He gained prizes. He went to bed with his wife. I don't know. There were so many things that he did. Of course, struggle is not all what there is. I think the point is that struggle has no end. If struggle has an end, it means either death or some salvation. What else, if not death or salvation? I mean, 9 billion people will be content and there will be end to the struggle. The question is, what form of struggle, or what forms of struggle? And the destituents power, or the destituents politic, if this is a phrase, can be an example of a struggle that leads in a different direction, but it is a very local struggle, and to think about it in a more radical sense, it involves not only anarchy, as Peter said rightly, it involves a messianic moment in both Benjamin and Agamben. So if you accept this messianic moment in the Benjaminian sense, at least, okay. But if not, then we are back to just different kinds of struggle and different kinds of institutions. So if this destituent power empties an institution, it doesn't mean that it empties all institutions. There will be another institution, some institution that would, in a successful struggle, some institution would be maintained because they supply food, or they give some other form of support. Some institution would be allowed to emerge, not necessarily to be constituted by force, but simply to emerge by habits and practice and routine and whatever. There were institutions in Occupy, in the square. There were institutions. They could not maintain order without some kind of power exercise. So I think that what I wonder about is actually I think that some of the questions came out as a result of a tendency to see something partial as the whole. And finally, the question about the significance of history, which I think it's crucial question. But the answer is, of course, it is changing. I mean, history cannot escape historicity. I mean, if the significance of history is also an historical phenomenon. And today it changes, obviously it changes, because of the prospect of a closed horizon for human history, because of the prospect of the end of the world. Thank you. I really enjoyed the session.
Thank you, Adi. Leon and Holly, do you want to respond?
I'm still stuck up on the idea of history. Yeah, the rated R thing, that was great. There's just this quote, Peter, thank you for the question about anarchism and time and temporality, which I think is really important. This is from the Invisible Committee pamphlet, where they say, the destituent gesture is thus desertion and attack, creation and wrecking, and all at once in the same gesture. It forms a linkage between the extended time of construction and the spasmodic time of intervention, between the disposition to enjoy our piece of the world and the disposition to place it at stake. Anyway, so I just think that, it's like, there's something about people who are trying to think about destituency that's like, it's thinking about like the longer, durée or whatever, and the spasmodic kind of eruption of kind of destruction, and the kind of creation and destruction are together. That seems important to the concept. And I mean, so I mean, I guess there's something about, again, just going back to the like everyone must go and like calling for, or like the abolitionist moment of saying like we should not have a world that in which people are in prison. That's different, and it should be separate from, well, then where should they go, right? I mean, that's also a necessary question, but I think it's maybe the move of destituents is to say that it's important to kind of separate them. Maybe, I don't know, just some ideas, but it was a great question.
So we are out of time and really at the end of our day. Let's just thank our two presenters. So thank you. I just want to make one last announcement, which is that Political Concepts is not just a conference, it's also a journal. It publishes periodically, I should say, and we would very much welcome your submissions. Those of you who presented your paper, please do think very seriously and in fact deliberatively towards submitting your paper to the journal. The information about submitting is at politicalconcepts.org, which is the website for the journal. But please also feel free to reach out to Adi, myself, or Sharon about that process at any point. We would love to see these papers worked up into contributions to the journal. So thank you all so much for still being here. 5:48 Saturday night. Been a really good day, good couple of days.
Thank you, Tim.
Thank you.